in the third and final part of this destructible terrain tutorial, I'm going to show you how to add a few nice little bits of graphics and shift the damage to a bullet so that when a bullet hits it, it blows a hole in it. It blows a hole in the terrain. And I'll also show you how to have a pathfinding grid get updated every time there's damage to the terrain. So the first thing that I'm adding is some improvements on the sprites. This is just a little 1:8, 1:8 with the origin in the top left, and it's just a brown sprite that's got a bit of noise and a bit of patterning to it. I did the second version of it with a bit of green stuff so that it's the top. I've also created this sprite, which is a triangle, put the origin down the bottom and called it SPR gun. This is going to be for, I'm going to be adding bullets and making the damage come from these bullets instead of a mouse click. So here's the bullet. That was just an 8x8 sprite origin in the middle. And then I've got this one, which is SPR explosion, which is just a series of colour changing sprites, which just bump 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 for a very simple explosion. That's all the sprites I need for this. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to grab object terrain and drag that new sprite onto it like that. Ding. Then I'm going to create an object called object terrain top. Which is going to have the other sprite. Ding. And this is going to be a parent of object terrain. Dragging the wrong thing. Whoa. Let's try that again. Dragging object terrain. There we go. And that, I think, is all I need to actually do to this. Well, I'll pop these into the room. So as you can see, the sprite's already changed for those. So if I just add this guy, and so yeah, let's just drag all of. There we go. Then put our top on it. There we go. I'm done with that room. Now what I'm going to need to do is I want to make bullets which on impact explode and do damage to the terrain object. So the first thing I'm going to do is create the explosion, which is nice and simple, just obj explosion. And then I'm going to assign the explosion sprite. And all I'm going to do here, because this is basically an object I'm using as an effect, so I just go down to other. Can't quite see that because it's gone off the, but add event, other, down here off the bottom of the screen, animation end, and then if we go into the animation end event, all I'm going to do is instance destroy, and all this does is the bullet, when it dies, is going to spawn this explosion. The explosion will play its animation once, and then once it's done, get thrown away. If you want to add any kind of particle effects, other things you could put in here. But for what I'm doing today, all this needs to do is run this animation and then boom. But if you were doing like a physics thing, you could do a collisions against this and apply physics to objects and push them away. You could throw particles around, but by putting the explosion on its own little separate thing, own little separate object, you can just encapsulate all the things you want to do with the explosion inside this explosion object. For me today, I'm just playing the animation and then insta-destroy, getting rid of it. So next I need a bullet. So obj bullets. Assign the bullet sprite. Here we go. Now this doesn't need that much in the way of code either. what I'm going to do is create a couple of movement vectors. Move vec x, which will be 0, and move vec y, which will also be 0, and then create a move speed, and we'll start with 1 for the moment. If we then add a step event, we will apply these vectors to move the objects, and that's just x plus equals move vector x times move speed, and y plus equals move vect y times move speed. It's a simple little bit of vector maths. All it does is just adds whatever your movement vector is multiplied by the speed that it's moving each step, and just goes dunk and moves it along. Now you should really at this point actually have a couple of little brackets and multiply it by the delta time to ensure that it moves smoothly irrespective of frame rate, but I'm not going to worry about that today. I'm then going to add a collision event with object terrain, and this is going to handle the actual registering of doing damage. But before we do that, I'm going to need to go back to object terrain and modify it so that it does, instead of having the damage on the left pressed event, I'm going to separate it out and put it in, or I'm going to change the event to, so change event and go other user event 0, and put it in user event. This event will then be called by the bullet when it hits it. But I also need to actually change the reference to the use of the mouse X and Y, because it now needs to have the bullets X and Y. What I'm going to do is use these damage XY variables that I had previously and store the damage in there. So what I now need to do is change each of these to the damage X and Y. So damage X here, damage Y. That's not how you spell damage. Here we go. So I need to change it there. I need to change it down here as well. So that's damage X. Or in fact, this is other damage X, because we're outside the yeah, this is passing the object terrain that's been hit is looping through all its neighbour terrain objects, and it's passing the value along. So this will access its value by using the other to reference back to the one that's actually been hit. So we put other damage Y, and then once we're in here we also need to change this to other damage X and other dot damage Y. Okay, so now what else do I need to change? Yeah, actually what I'm going to do is in here I'm going to change this sprite. So instead of the custom sprite, I'm going to use the explosion sprite. So I'm going to make SPR explosion, and I want the max size one. So this is 1, 2, 3, 4, 3, 2, 1. Yeah, 1, 2, and 3, because the 0 is too small. I'm going to use one of these sprites to actually cut the hole. So I'll use sprite 1. If I go back up here, change to sprite 1, the hole will be cut with to match the size of the explosion, which means if I change the explosion sprite later, then it should, well, depending on what image it is, but it'll then match the hole to fit whatever the sprite is. So now I need to go back to the bullet and actually add into the bit of code that passes the information on, because essentially it's come to this event because the bullet hit object terrain, and that's triggered this collision event. So now it needs to tell object terrain that it's hit it and where it's hit it, and tell it to apply damage. So I'm going to use the other keyword, because in this instance the other is referencing to the object terrain that it's hit. So other damage x equals x, and other dot damage y equals y. So now essentially the bullets hit terrain, and it's told the terrain object the xy value of where it's hit it. What I'll then need to do is trigger the user event for the object terrain, and we do that with other, if I spell other correctly, with other event user 0. So that will then call what was the left pressed event and is now event user 0, which will actually calculate the damage stuff and flag it. Then I need to create an instance of the explosion objects. So I'll use instance create. I can either create by depth or by layer. As I didn't go and properly name my layers, it's easier at this point just to use depth and create it at the same depth of the bullet. So at the bullet's x, y coordinates, I'm going to create the explosion obj explosion, and I'm going to create it at depth. Got the order of those wrong. Depth is the third thing. I'm going to use the depth of the bullet and create object explosion there. So that's the explosion created. Now I just need to get rid of the bullet, and that's instance destroy. Ding! Why is there an error up there? Because I put a comma instead of a semicolon. Doi. There we go. So now the bullet has hit it and passed and triggered damage. Now I'm going to test this, and what I'm going to do is I'm actually come over here and I'm going to change the y vector to 1 so it defaults to down, and then I'm going to open the room like this, and I'm going to pop in a bunch of bullets about the place like that, and then I'm going to run the game, and as you see, as they're falling, there we go, they hit and they do damage like little bombs. Dong dong dong. There we go. So now what I want to do is close the debugger. I'm going to remove these from the room, and that's nice and easy. I'll just come down here, select that one, select the bottom one, delete. That's all of them gone. Close the room editor. I don't think I need to do anything with object bullet anymore. But now what I'm going to do is object gun to fire the bullet. So I'm going to create an object, call it object gun. I'm going to assign it this little triangle sprite that I created earlier. And the code for this is going to be real simple. I mean, it's only a test object, doesn't need to move, doesn't need to do anything. All it needs to do is when I left click on the screen, it's going to fire a bullet. And for that, I'm going to use the, if we go in the mouse events, I'm going to use the global event of left pressed. So wherever I click on the screen, it's going to, this will fire a bullet in that direction. So what I'll need to do is get the direction to where I click the mouse. So if I do var m and I use the point direction function, and it's from the gun's XY position to mouse X, mouse Y. So this is now, so now I've got the direction I want the bullet to go in. What I need to do is create a normalized vector, an X and Y normalized vector that I can then give to the bullet. Because if you remember when I created the bullet, it operates by applying a vector each step to send it in that direction. So there's a little function that Gamemaker has called length dir. There's length dir x and length dir y, and these are really helpful for creating normalized vectors, because all you do is once you've got a direction like this, you just supply them give it to the function with a length of 1, and it returns effectively a normalized vector. So if I go vec x equals length dir x, a length of 1 in the direction towards the mouse, and then var vec y equals length dir y 1 comma dir m. So now vec x and vec y are a normalized vector in the direction of the mouse click. So I need a bullet. So var bullet equals instance create, and again I'm going to do inst create depth, and at the guns x, y, and at the same depth of the gun. So let's make it depth -1 on a slightly different depth. We're going to create obj bullet. There it is. And now, having created the bullet, we just need to assign the vector that was created to the bullet. So the bullet's move vector x equals vec x, and bullet dot move vec y equals vec y. So that will send the bullet on its merry way. Now I'm actually going to speed the bullet up as well before I check this by giving it a speed of 5. Now if I open room 1 and then put an obj gun in there, stick it at the top there, there we go, close it and save it and run. So now we have the gun object floating on the train object, and if I left click, there we go, out come lots of bullets, and they make a hole in the train. Look at that. Isn't that the coolest? But what about having some kind of pathfinding grid going on so that things can pathfind and fly around in the new holes you're creating? Because what if you want to create a game where you're a little spaceship flying around and you shoot holes through the level to get from one place to another? So, first thing I'm going to do is create a new object, and I'm going to call it obj pathfinder, and I'm going to put it in the room. Except I need to create a new instance layer because I need to put it above. I'll explain why in a moment, but create a new instance layer and put it above. Then close the room. Now, I'm going to add a create event because we need to create a pathfinding grid. Now, I'm going to create a grid size variable, and I'm going to make the grid size 4. Depending on the size of your room and its complexity and so forth, you can vary the size of your grid for efficiency's sake and stuff. But generally, when I made Captain Kale, for instance, I had some quite large rooms and a grid size of, I think it was 16. And generally, it was pretty quick and robust and stuff. It doesn't take that long to calculate, as long as you're sensible about where you do your pathfinding calls. So a grid size of 4 will be fine. Then create a path grid. So make the variable path grid and put a grid inside it with the MP grid create. My typing is rubbish. MP grid create. Let's just move this somewhere I can see it properly. So the left and the top XY is just 0, 0. These are room coordinates. So top left of the room. The number of cells will be room width divided by grid size. Likewise, the vertical cell nut count is room height divided by grid size. And then the cell width and cell height is of course just grid size and grid size. So now I've created the grid. One last thing I want to do is just create a draw grid boolean flag, set it to false. This is so I can toggle on and off the drawing of the grid. Now we need to add a room start event, because when the room starts you want to actually, so the grid starts empty or full, empty, starts empty, and you want to add stuff to block the grid with the MP grid add instances. So this says you tell it, give it an object, and it'll or an instance of an object, and it'll add it to the grid as flag any cells that it crosses over with as out of bounds, so they won't move there. So we give it the path grid index you want to use, and the object that you want flagged. So I want all terrain objects and their children to be flagged as to block the path essentially. And I don't want it to be precise because these are giant squares at this point, so you don't need to be precise with it. That's all you need to room start. Then I'm going to add a draw in the draw event. I want to actually draw the grid for debugging and figuring stuff out purposes. So in the draw event, you just say if draw grid. Now you want to set your draw set alpha to something like 0.2, because otherwise it just draws block color that fills the screen and you won't be able to see your game underneath. And any time you set the alpha like this, you also have to reset it when you're done. Otherwise it will start drawing your entire game with an alpha of 0.2, and then everything will just look a bit rubbish. And then there's a nice little helper function which is MP grid draw. You just call that, supply the path grid that you want to draw, and it'll draw the grid for you. Nice and easy. Now I just need to actually toggle drawing this on and off. So I'm going to use the add event key pressed and space. So anytime I press the space key, I want to toggle drawing the path grid on and off, and that's really easy to do by just saying draw grid equals not draw grid, and that just toggles your boolean value. So now if I well, hopefully if I save this and run it, it'll work. Okay, here we are with the gun at the top and the terrain, and if I hit space, we'll see that all these little red squares, that's where the pathfinding won't let you go, and all these green squares is where it will let you go. So the next problem you have to figure out is, when I make all these nice little holes in the terrain object needs to update the pathfinding so that you can actually, anything that wants to pathfind down that hole can go down that hole. So I need to go to obj terrain, back into obj terrain, and in the draw event here, once we've redrawn this sprite and it's changed, or once its collision mask down here has changed, we now need to use it to create a update the pathfinding. Now we can use the MP add instance to just add this thing's instance, but also first we need to actually clear the grid where it currently is. So we have to empty all the squares and then refill them with whatever it's now covering. We also need to actually slightly buffer this because of a weird little pixel overlap error that will occur if we don't. So I need to create a var buff equals 2. I probably only need a buffer of 2. And then I go mp grid clear rectangle. And I'm clearing obj pathfinder dot path grid. So I'm clearing that, and I'm clearing it from x plus buff, y plus buff, and then add sprite width, and x plus sprite width minus buff, and y plus sprite height minus buff. Now what this does is it basically clears, it slightly contracts, instead of the exact 1:8 square area that it's currently inhabiting, because where the boundary is there's a single pixel of possible overlap and it can cause an error. I'm slightly shrinking the box that I tell it to clear, because it's going to clear anything overlaps, as long as this buff value is less than whatever the size of your cell is. Like if your cells are a size of 4, as they are now, then this buffer is size of 2. It's still going to catch everything, and that's fine. And now I've cleared the space, I need to then block anything on the path grid that is covered by the new version of the sprite by using the mp grid add instances obj pathfinder dot path grid, and it's any instance of this function clears. If you give it an object index, it will clear every instance of that object. If you just give it a single instances index, which I will with ID, it's just going to clear this one's ID. And I want it to be precise this time, because I'm not just clearing a block square, I'm clearing like individual things, so it needs to be precise, so that's true. The other thing I need to do is I want to check if you make enough Swiss cheese out of it, you can just make so many holes that there's nothing left of the terrain. In which case it's basically drawing an empty object all the time. Taking out memory doesn't need to be there. So what I want to do is delete any, if this instance no longer exists, then delete it. And I'm going to actually squeeze it in between here. And what I'm going to do is use the collision, do a collision check, use a collision rectangle to do a collision check over the top of where it is, and if it returns true, then at least one pixel of the sprite still survives, because there's one. Essentially I'm checking the collision mask and saying, is there any pixels left on the collision mask? Because if there aren't any pixels left on the collision mask, then the object doesn't exist and I can delete it. And I'm going to use the collision rectangle to do that. So var col check collision, my typing is rubbish, check equals collision rectangle. Where is it? Yep, collision rectangle. X, Y to X plus sprite width, Y plus sprite height. Obj terrain, because I'm looking for a terrain object. Precision true. And not me false, because I do want to check for me, because me is the object that is calling it. Now, if col check, see, collision rectangle will check against where it is. If it doesn't find anything, it will set col check to no one. So if col check equals no one, then this instance no longer has any actual terrain associated with it, so it can be removed. So instance destroy. Yeah. So now if I save this and run it, so this time, ding 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 ding, we see the path grid is being updated, and yep. Okay, so there it is. There's how to do destructible terrain in Gamemaker 2, and how to make it at least a little bit polished and useful. I hope this has been a useful tutorial. If you use it for anything, do any cool little games, let me know. It would be really cool to see what stuff you create with this. But otherwise, until my next tutorial, enjoy making games, and I'll see you later.